The greatest events, they are not our loudest, but our most silent hours. True power isn't about winning arguments. It's about mastering yourself and guiding interactions strategically. How many times have you tried to convince someone with logical arguments, only to realize that instead of winning the discussion, the other person became even more resistant? This happens because most debates aren't about finding the truth. They're about feeding the ego. The more we try to prove a point, the more the other person clings to their own. In the end, no one wins. Only energy is wasted. The reality is that people engage in debates not to learn, but to validate their own beliefs. And this creates an endless cycle. You argue, they counter, the conversation heats up, and the original point gets lost. In the heat of the moment, we forget what truly matters. It's not the logic of the argument that determines the outcome, but how emotions shape one's perception of reality, the power of silence, and the mastery of the mind. Inspired by Friedrich Nietzsche's philosophy on the pursuit of power, this concept can be applied to everyday life in a surprising way. Through silence, Nietzsche saw power not as the ability to impose ideas by force, but as the ability to control oneself, and by doing so, influence others. Instead of reacting impulsively, a true strategist chooses when to speak and when to remain silent. Arguing may seem like the natural way to prove a point, but the truth is that most heated discussions don't lead to real change. And there's a reason for that. The human brain is not wired to easily accept arguments that challenge its beliefs. On the contrary, when someone feels their ideas are being attacked, their immediate instinct is to defend, not reflect. This happens because of what psychologists call confirmation bias. Instead of rationally analyzing new information, we tend to seek evidence that reinforces what we already believe. In other words, the harder you try to defeat someone in an argument, the more they cling to their own opinion. The result? You don't convince anyone. You only create more resistance. The mistake of arguing to prove you're right. Another common mistake is confusing debate with social validation. Many people enter discussions not because they want to learn something new, but because they want to prove they're right. And when the goal is not knowledge, but winning at all costs, every conversation turns into a battle of egos. If you find yourself arguing just to reaffirm your position, know that you've already fallen into this trap. And there's an even bigger problem. Emotional reactivity weakens any argument. The moment you lose control and start responding in the heat of the moment, you've already lost. Who reacts is being manipulated by the environment. Who remains silent controls the dynamics of the conversation. Most conflicts are not won with words, but with presence and posture. Nietzsche argued that true power does not lie in countering every provocation, but in mastering one's own reactions. Silence as a strategy of power. Nietzsche understood power in a way that few do. To him, true mastery was not about brute force or imposing ideas, but about shaping reality without being a slave to one's emotions. His concept of will to power was not just about dominating others, but above all, about mastering oneself. At the core of this idea is the Übermensch, the overman, one who transcends instinctive reactions and acts strategically. He doesn't get irritated by provocations. He doesn't waste energy trying to prove a point. He doesn't react automatically to external stimuli. He observes, reflects, and chooses when and how to respond. This concept directly connects to the power of strategic silence. For Nietzsche, silence was not a sign of passivity, but a powerful tool of control. Who masters silence commands respect without wasting energy. Instead of falling into the trap of emotional debates, he creates tension and forces the other person to reveal themselves. Silence has a deep psychological effect. When someone expects a response and is met with nothing but a pause, uncertainty begins to eat away at their confidence. The human mind hates emptiness, and in the face of silence, it fills the space with doubt and speculation. True power is not about speaking louder. True power is knowing when silence says everything. The secret of strategic silence. True power doesn't come from reacting to every provocation. It comes from allowing the other person to get lost in their own insecurity. Nietzsche believed that most people were prisoners of their own emotions, and that true strength did not come from imposition, but from mastering one's own reactions. In his words, he who cannot command himself will always end up being commanded by someone else. And in the real world, this principle holds true. Leaders, strategists, and influencers understand that speaking less is often the key to gaining more. But silence as a tool of power is not just a theory. It has been applied by some of the greatest minds in history, from philosophers and samurai to magnates and negotiators, and they all understood one simple truth. Who controls silence controls the game. Silence as the weapon of great masters. Socrates never needed to prove he was right. He simply asked questions. His method, known as Socratic maieutic, did not impose answers. Instead, it led the other person to contradict themselves, allowing their own logic to bring them to the truth. This not only avoided direct conflict, but also made any shift in opinion feel like a personal achievement rather than a defeat, and this technique is still used today by the world's greatest negotiators and strategists. Instead of trying to convince someone outright, they ask strategic questions, questions that lead the other person to see the flaws in their own reasoning. This doesn't just diffuse conflicts, it creates a far greater impact than simply telling someone what to think. And this strategy wasn't just used by philosophers. Silence as a tool of power. Steve Jobs mastered this art. He knew that in negotiations and presentations, silence was his greatest weapon. When he wanted his team or partners to make a decision, he did something unusual. He stopped talking and waited. The discomfort of silence forced others to fill the space, and often they ended up agreeing to exactly what Jobs wanted. This calculated pause created tension and anticipation. When he finally spoke, his words carried weight. He controlled the rhythm of conversations and led his audience to reflect. This ability not only helped build Apple, but also made him one of the most influential figures in the corporate world. And the same principle was used in a completely different context. Silence in war. Musashi's strategy. The legendary Samurai Miyamoto Musashi knew that a fight began long before the first sword was drawn. He used silence to destabilize his opponents. When challenged to a duel, he would arrive late on purpose, forcing his enemy to wait, to be consumed by anxiety, to doubt himself. This psychological game weakened the opponent's confidence before the battle even began, and during combat, Musashi took this concept even further. He adopted a minimalist fighting style. He never wasted energy on unnecessary strikes. He never acted on impulse. He never let fear or anger dictate his actions. He simply observed. He waited for an opening, and he struck at the exact moment. That's how he became one of the greatest warriors in history. Why do most people fail to use silence? The principle behind these stories is clear. Whoever controls silence controls the situation. In debates, negotiations, or battles, the one who remains calm and uses strategic pauses gains the upper hand. But if this is so powerful, why do so many people fail to use this technique? The answer lies in the psychology of reactivity. The human mind hates the void. When faced with silence, it panics and tries to fill it at any cost. And this is where those who master silence take control. Because while others get lost in their words, the true strategist simply observes, waits, and wins. Why do people fear silence? If silence is such a powerful weapon, why do most people feel the need to fill every space with words? The answer lies in human psychology. Our minds are not programmed for silence. On the contrary, they react impulsively to external stimuli, especially when we feel challenged. And here's the secret that few people realize. Arguments are not just a battle of ideas. To the brain, a debate is a fight for identity, control, and validation. The invisible cycle of resistance. One of the biggest obstacles to productive conversations is confirmation bias, also known as selective evidence gathering. This means that instead of analyzing an argument impartially, the brain only seeks out information that reinforces what it already believes, and it ignores everything that contradicts it. So, when someone challenges us in a debate, we don't see it as an opportunity to learn. We see it as a threat. Our immediate instinct is not to reflect, but to counter, defend, reaffirm our beliefs. And no matter how logical the opposing evidence is, the effect is the opposite of what was intended. The person does not change their mind. They only cling even more tightly to what they already believed. And so, we enter an invisible cycle of resistance. There is no learning. There is no growth, only exhaustion. The trap of impulsive reaction. Another reason we react so quickly is because we interpret criticism as attacks on our identity. When someone questions our beliefs, whether political, religious, or moral, we don't see it as a simple difference of opinion. We see it as a personal attack. And here comes one of the most primitive mechanisms of our brain, the amygdala, the region responsible for emotional and instinctive responses. It interprets any threat as something to fight against. And so, without realizing it, we put reason aside and are taken over by defensive impulses and aggression. This explains why so many discussions spiral out of control, why so many debates, instead of bringing clarity, result in more confusion. Because in the heat of the moment, we're not trying to understand the other person. We're just trying to protect ourselves. Silence, as proof of mastery, it is in this context that silence reveals itself as an act of strength. Because when you remain silent, you demonstrate something rare. You don't need to defend yourself from everything. You have control over yourself. Many people believe that by speaking louder or imposing their opinions, they gain influence. But in reality, those who speak too much lose authority. True control doesn't lie in dominating others, but in mastering your own reaction. Those who feel the need to respond to everything are actually being controlled by their environment. And if you doubt this, think of the great leaders and strategists in history. They were rarely the ones who spoke the most. They were the ones who knew how to listen, observe, and act at the right moment. Because in the end, strategic silence is not a sign of weakness. It is a sign of maturity, and above all, of power. How to apply strategic silence in everyday life. Knowing that silence is a powerful tool is just the first step. The real question is, how do you put it into practice? The secret lies in 3 fundamental techniques. Use silence as a response. 2. Control your nonverbal communication. 3. Employ strategic pauses to gain an advantage. If applied correctly, these techniques can completely transform your interactions, negotiations, and even your social presence. Now, let's break each of them down. Silence as a response. In many situations, the best way to assert yourself is not by countering an argument, but by allowing the other person to deal with their own discomfort. Imagine someone makes a provocative comment expecting you to defend yourself. If you react, you're playing on their terms. But if you just give a slight smile and don't respond, you create psychological tension. The absence of response forces the other person to fill the void, and often, in this process, they back down, contradict themselves, or even lose control. Silence disarms manipulations and exposes the weakness of the opponent's argument. And the most interesting part, it forces the other person to doubt their own discourse. The body language of silence. What differentiates someone who is silent because they are insecure from someone who is silent because they are in control? The answer lies in nonverbal communication. Firm, relaxed posture, without slumped shoulders or unnecessary tension. Constant eye contact, but without exaggeration. Conveying confidence, calm breathing, not rushing to react. Your behavior speaks louder than your words. People who speak quickly and without pauses transmit anxiety, while those who use silence between sentences transmit power. Leaders, negotiators, and politicians do this all the time. The pause before a response creates expectation, and it forces the other person to pay closer attention to what will be said. The power of strategic pauses. Strategic silence doesn't mean remaining silent all the time. It means knowing when to speak and when to let the other person get lost in their own words. Mastering this skill is what separates impulsive people from true social strategists. If there's one central lesson in everything we've discussed so far, it's that true power doesn't come from talking more. It comes from controlling when and how to speak. And those who learn to use silence strategically will never again be ignored. True power lies in control. The one who masters the impulse to react impulsively becomes naturally more respected, more influential, and harder to manipulate. Nietzsche taught us that the will to power starts within us, and figures like Socrates, Steve Jobs, and Miyamoto Musashi showed how silence can be a powerful weapon in any social interaction. There's an invisible game of influence happening all the time, and those who understand this game stop falling into the trap of useless debates and begin using silence to become a stronger presence. Now, I invite you to try something different. In your next conversation, use strategic silence. Wait, observe, don't rush to respond. See how this impacts the dynamics around you. And if you've used this strategy before, or want to share your experience, leave a comment below. Let's exchange ideas about this silent power.